Okay, first off, there's very few of you guys here today. For those of you who are normally in this class and are staying home because of the weather, good work. I want everybody to stay safe. Thank you guys for everybody who is here. Loads looked pretty good on my way in, but obviously you guys do what you need to do to stay safe. So let's get going. We're in chapter 3 now. With the snow day, I've had a hard time kind of remembering where we were. I'll get you on attendance at the end, okay? Okay. Today, the main theme we're going to talk about is who decides. We're going to start talking about federalism in detail, but I want you guys to keep in mind that when we talked about that kind of institutional framework, the most important thing we talked about is we're deciding who decides on issues or how we decide about it. And so today we're going to start looking into that question. Federalism isn't just geography, it's a set of rules that shapes conflict, policy, and accountability. So what we're going to cover today and what we'll cover next class, today we're going to talk about the definition of federalism. We're going to explain why the U.S. decided to use it, identify which powers belong where, so basically what are the basic constitutional categories of what's federal versus what's state. We're going to understand that federalism creates winners, losers, and changes the strategies that you're going to employ if you want to advocate for a particular issue. And then finally, we're going to go through a couple of examples so you guys can see the who decides framework here. Next class, we're going to talk about grants, mandates, and the strings you can attach to different things, the preemption fights, state versus federal that we have, policy variations between the different states, accountability problems, what makes it hard, or we can look at it instead of who decides who to blame. And then finally, we're going to apply some case studies with there's an optional Missouri tie-in that we might throw into. So I'm going to ask a couple of quick prompts just to get everybody thinking to begin with. We'll go around the room and, I just need about 2 shout-outs, 2 things. So what is one issue that you think is purely a federal or national issue? I love the suit. I'll get to you on attendance in a few minutes. All right. So can you guys name one issue that you think is purely a federal issue? What does the federal government get to decide that the state does not?
Education.
Education? That's going to be a really complicated one, but I like that. That's a good one. Anything else? All right, let's take it from the other direction. And what are some issues that you think only states or local governments get to decide? All right. This is the point where I think I start saying Bueller, but that's all right. We'll skip the questions for now and jump into the definition. So, what's the core definition of federalism? Federalism is shared sovereignty or authority divided between a national government and state government. Sovereignty basically means like the power of the king. There's no one above you. You are the person who gets to make the final call. And in federalism, we're going to split that, and the federal government and the state government are both sovereign. It gets even more interesting when we deal with Native American reservations because they're another sovereign entity that's kind of thrown into the mix too. And so Native American reservation may exist within a state to which the reservation is sovereign, and in the federal government, and then the federal government and the reservation kind of share that sovereignty as well. So what is federalism not? Federalism is not just a states' rights slogan. It's not just like states have power. There's actually a lot of legal stuff that goes in here. There's a lot of differentiation between what is going to be allowed at the federal level versus the state level. This is not local control. We have local control. There are, like we're in Jefferson City. Jefferson City has some powers that the state says that cities can have. So when we say federalism, we're not talking purely about guaranteeing that federal control. In a minute, we'll talk about how states can have different ways of setting things up. And while all of them pretty much do, it's conceivable that they would not permit that granular local control. Federalism is not just two layers. Again, we have multiple layers of government because we have the federal government, the state government, the county government, the city government. Here at Lincoln, we have kind of our own governmental things, but we exist within the city of Jefferson City, the county of Cole, the state of Missouri, and the United States of America. So there's a lot of layers to this. It's not just a two-layer system. And then finally, this is not a guarantee of small government or big government. Sweet. I do not have to walk home today. That's awesome. Federalism is a design choice. It rearranges power. And I want you guys to be really clear about that. We're going to talk about this in a minute. But we chose this way of structuring our government, and it is definitely not without trade-offs, but it works really well for us. So I want to talk about why. Because federalism can basically be explained, the reason we did it can basically be explained in three buckets. The first is that we have the size and the diversity of the United States. It's a giant country. It has diverse preferences. Dividing up the power and who gets to decide can reduce the conflict that exists. While we talked about in a democracy, conflict is essential. If we can kind of limit those conflicts at the federal level or at the national level to those issues that should be federal or national, we can prevent a lot of strife from occurring. Because of this, states can fit policy to local conditions. When I was in law school, my property professor was lecturing about who owns what sand on a beach. The question was, there were some people who were out walking and they got charged with trespassing on some private property. And I don't remember, I think it's the federal Supreme Court decided that no, the property line is the mean tide line. But Professor Carbone, as awesome as she was, had a really difficult time getting the class to recognize that if you want to enjoy the beach, you have to be able to walk on the beach. Because being landlocked here in Missouri, we don't often think about who owns what sand, right? It doesn't make sense for Missouri to have a whole bunch of laws on the books or to have to go through the federal government to get a whole bunch of laws on the books to regulate, how you take care of sea turtles, for example, when that's not an issue that concerns us in the slightest in Missouri. So, don't get me wrong, I'm all for the sea turtles, but not something that we need to spend time working on here, or that the country as a whole needs to spend time working on. That's something better left to local control. So the second bucket, this is definitely experimentation. It has its risks, but this is one of the first times that this has been set up, and it was set up intentionally. The Founding Fathers wanted to give us the best opportunity to find out what worked well in a democracy and what we needed to kind of prune away. How best to do that than to have lots of different labs running, right? If you think about it now, you might, want to use AI to get an answer to a problem, and so you'll put it into a couple of different prompts or a couple of different systems. You might use Claude, Gemini, and ChatGPT. And each of those is going to say something a little bit different. You may want to run it a couple of times to say, all right, it told me this is a great idea this time. If I run the same prompt again, is it going to still say that this chicken farm is a great idea? I don't know, insert thing you want to do here. The answer is maybe, maybe not. When we do experiments, it is best to have lots of different experiments running. And the Founding Fathers recognized this. So in setting up and giving the states the ability to self-govern, they guaranteed at the onset, 13 different labs were running. Later on, it's now up to 50 something. It's an interesting question because of the territories and how much power they have. Variation lets states try different approaches. So, does anybody know of a state that doesn't even profess to be a state?
Texas.
Texas is one. Yeah. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is another. If you ask, hey, tell us about your state, they're like, well, the Commonwealth. Different ways of looking at things. What's the best? Who knows? But it gives us an idea of here's things other people have tried and things that we can use in other places. This happens a lot in the judicial system. So in terms of how do we, use the Commonwealth model that Massachusetts has, we probably don't. But we do borrow a lot in terms of the statutes that are drafted. If something's working really well in one state, we might pull it over and use it in our state. Sometimes it leads to problems, especially when it's not clean drafting. I argued a case once where the statute had just been copied and pasted from like the federal statutes, and it had all these references to things that didn't exist within state law because they just tried to translate it like line for line. And so like, according to section, 523.010C, it's like, there's only A and B. What are you guys pointing at here? Come on, fix it up. But absent that, it gives us a good wealth of knowledge to draw from. But variation can also create inequality and uneven rights. So if you think about it in terms of something like minimum wage, or I know, like, again, I don't want to touch the ethics of it, but the right to an abortion. It's strange that you can be sitting here in Missouri and the law is one thing, and you can go across the river to Illinois and the law is something different, right? That is something that this system unfortunately creates. There's some fragmentation that goes on. And then finally, we have power and liberty. That's bucket 3. By dividing power, we can prevent tyranny. That's the hope, right? If we were to say, all right, we have 2 kings, then one king can't really be tyrannical over the other, right? This is the way that Rome set up their Senate. So Rome had 2 councils, and the council was the person who would be able to make decisions in the absence of the Senate when they weren't in session. But by having 2, they had to agree on the decision they were going to make. So it just is another way of limiting the power if you're going to divide that power in half. This can also create gridlock and accountability confusion. Because unlike the Roman system where both levels of government had to agree, we've created a system where the federal government can only act on some things, the state government can only act on some things. Some of them they both can act, and some of them neither of them can act on at all. So if you want to know why your minimum wage isn't higher, who are you going to point the finger at? If you're working 40 hours a week and you're like, I can't pay rent, is that a state problem or is that a federal problem? It's kind of both, right? But the problem with it is that both are going to point at the other one. If you want a higher minimum wage, that's fine. Talk to your state legislature. They can raise the minimum wage for the state. Maybe on the other side, you're like, I want to not have to pay back my student loans with such high interest. Is that a federal issue or a state issue? That's a federal issue. They're the ones who created the entire scheme that controls how our student loans run. So if at the end of the day you want more money in your pocket, there's lots of different levers you can pull. Some of them are state, some of them are federal, some of them are both. As I said, federalism creates trade-offs. It's flexibility versus uniformity, experimentation versus inequality, and diffusion versus clarity. So I have 4 different things here that are going to kind of fall into the trade-offs to give you guys concrete examples. And what I want you to do is I'll read them, and if you think it's a good thing, I want you to raise your hand. If you think it's a bad thing, keep your hand down. And then keep them up because I'm going to call on one person from each side to say why you think it's good and bad. Everybody needs to participate. If you're not raising or keeping your hand down, you will for sure get called on. All right. States can set different minimum wages. Is that good or bad? If it's good, hands up. Nobody thinks that's a good thing. All right. Why is it a bad thing? Are you good?
No. I guess it just depends on the type of state you're in. Like if you're like a big state with a lot more people, then it's probably better for it to be higher because it's less money going around.
Okay, so your team, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Whose team, bad thing?
I mean, if one state is increasing minimum wage, then the market of the United States economy is, let's say, high, then the other states surround it. I mean, that wouldn't really be fair necessarily, which is why we leave it to the federal government to like increase it to like $17 for everyone or something like that. So it's more even, I guess, balanced with the economy of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. So both very valid answers. You know, it doesn't make sense when the cost of living in Missouri is a lot lower to have the same minimum wage as California. At the same time, it doesn't make sense that California can be like, we're going to set a minimum wage of $30 and we're going to get everybody who can relocate here, right? So different things here. 2, voting rules differ by state. Is this fair or not? Who's eligible to vote? Who's on the ballot? Could be very different in Missouri versus Illinois. And let me take a quick aside and say I use Missouri and Illinois as an example because traditionally Missouri is rather conservative when it comes to presidential elections. Illinois is rather liberal when it comes to presidential elections. And that trend kind of carries down through the government of the states. And so I use that because while Illinois is one of our several neighbors, it's probably the most different from Missouri. So if I were to say Missouri and Kansas, we both tend to lean right or be more conservative. And so that's not a very stark difference. So I am not picking on the other states or picking on Illinois. It's just that that's a different political end of the spectrum. So who thinks that it's a good idea that we can have different voter rules by state? All right, I'm going to call on you. Good thing or bad thing? The cool thing about this is there is no wrong answer. You just have to say why you think it is the way it is. You think it could be a good thing? Yeah? Why do you think it could be a good thing?
Certain people have different rules. Everybody has their own thing.
I'm sorry?
So everybody has different rules that they want to apply to.
Yeah. Maybe, different states have different ways of doing it, and that experimentation could be a good thing, right? And then over there, you're going to be my next victim. You're going to say why it's a bad thing. So you're going to identify voting rules can differ by state. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I'm telling you because nobody's raising their hands, you're going to be team bad side. So why is it bad that who's eligible to vote or who's on the ballot could be different by crossing a state line?
You probably put in this.
Okay, anybody want to help her out? Shoot.
I mean, I don't know that it would be a good thing because if it's like swayed one way in one state and swayed the other way, like it might not end up being fair. I think for it to all have like the same rules,
Mm-hmm.
it would come out more evenly dispersed and more of like a fair, I guess, overall election.
If we were to have one uniform rule.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so one of the interesting things is that this is a very real hypothetical, because in the 2024 presidential election, kind of leading up to that, Colorado removed Donald Trump from the ballot because they said it violated the amendment that says that you may not be eligible for office if you have engaged in insurrection. Could you imagine what would happen if, by default, he didn't get any popular vote from Colorado? And while I think that he lost the state anyway, so it didn't have an effect on the electoral vote, certainly that would have made that popular vote different, right? The Supreme Court weighed in on that case and said that no, for presidential elections, we're the ultimate authority, basically. But that kind of goes against this sort of thing. But can you imagine the patchwork if some states were like, no, we're just going to say that the liberal candidate or the conservative candidate isn't eligible. And they could write their rules in such a way to prevent them from ever being able to be on a ballot. So there's definitely some truth on both sides there too. Next, health policy varies widely between states. And because I'm having such a hard time getting volunteers, I'm just going to tell you, yeah, with this, again, this is the sort of thing that we saw during COVID. If you were to go to downtown Chicago during the height of the pandemic, there were mask mandates places. Businesses wouldn't allow you in if you weren't wearing your mask. A lot of places went to remote operations. Here in rural Missouri, it was a lot different. There was a lot more, wear the mask if you want to. Nobody's going to really get in trouble for it, kind of stuff. And the pro for this is that different regions are going to have different things when it comes to health, right? The way that we need to respond to allergens, for example, when we have all these trees and flowers and everything, is going to be different than Arizona, for example, where they've got so much desert. Maybe they don't have to invest so much in that sort of stuff. So it's definitely a bad thing in that the way we're treating different things can change just by crossing a state line. It's a good thing because those health concerns can be addressed on a more regional level. And then the last one is federal law can override state law. This one as well is kind of a toss-up because it doesn't make sense that you have two sovereigns, but one of them has the edge over the other. At the same time, to prevent absolute gridlock, you kind of have to have one of them with the edge over the other. So the Second Amendment is a big issue with this, and it goes back and forth. Traditionally, liberal states would try and curtail the use of guns or the ability to carry them around. We talked about D.C. v. Heller last time, where Washington, D.C. pretty much had an ordinance that said if you want to have a gun, no problem, but you have to keep it locked up. That's different than Missouri, that is on the other side of the spectrum. And I think it was not last term, but the term before, our legislature passed a law that basically made it a crime to investigate people for weapons offenses occurring after a certain date. And when I say occurring, I mean the weapons offense was created after a certain date. So things like bump stocks, you guys have heard about. Missouri said that it is unlawful in the state of Missouri for any law enforcement officer to investigate that kind of thing. But federal law is going to trump that. Specifically, they didn't say Missouri people. They said if a federal agent is here and they investigate it, then they are guilty of something that they have to pay a $50,000 fine. And if any Missouri law enforcement officer helps them, they also have to pay a $50,000 fine. That didn't stand up. The Court of Appeals struck it down pretty quickly because it violates that supremacy clause we talked about. So next, powers the Constitution categorizes. There are 4 different categories of power, and we're going to talk about where each of them belong, and I'll give you some examples of them. The first is the enumerated powers. The enumerated powers are those powers that the federal government has. So the Commerce Clause is my favorite because it says the Congress shall have the power to regulate interstate commerce. That's not something that states get to do. This sets up something that legally is called the Dormant Commerce Clause or the Inverse Commerce Clause. And so when states do things to try and put their thumb on the scale of interstate commerce, they're often struck down pretty quickly. For example, maybe Missouri decides that we want to make some extra money from truck revenue because we have lots of trucks that cross our state on I-70, right? If we put up a toll booth and we say any out-of-state truck has to pay a fee to use our roads, but Missouri trucks can just go through because they're already here, that's a burden on interstate commerce. That's something only Congress gets to do. So those are enumerated powers. Next are reserved powers. These are the powers that it says specifically that the state has the authority to do. This is going to be most criminal law, most family law, most education policy, except we'll talk about some limitations next class mostly. But these are going to be things that traditionally are called part of the police power. Regulating the day-to-day lives of citizens is going to be more of a state thing than a federal thing. Next, we have the concurrent powers. These are the ones that are going to be shared between the federal and state branches. This is going to be things like taxation, courts, and infrastructure. We have the federal highway system. That's a federal thing, but it exists on state land. And states also create roads that attach to and go off from the federal system, right? Taxation. We have the federal income tax. We also have state income tax. We also have state sales tax. There's also tariffs that are basically a tax on you when you buy something that originated from an out-of-state country. These are all different taxes. And while a state can't impose a tariff, a state can do sales tax while the federal government can't. So there's different levels there as well. And then finally, there's prohibited powers. These are forbidden to use or for one or both. States can't make treaties, for example. The federal government cannot violate your right to due process, or the federal government. So a little bit of this is ethereal because the federal government shouldn't be able to dictate what we have to do when it comes to education, but we'll talk in a minute about how they do anyway. Do they have the ability to make a law that says you shall educate this way? No, but they control it by money. An interesting note here is that the Bill of Rights, when it was originally written, because we went over that a little bit, I think last class, didn't actually apply to the states in the beginning. It does now, a lot of it anyway. Sorry, students are texting me saying, can't make it. And I'm like, well, probably not. It's 30 minutes in and we've only got 20 minutes left. But I appreciate it nonetheless that you're letting me know. The Bill of Rights didn't originally apply to the states. Through a process called incorporation, the Supreme Court has said, hey, this is such a fundamental thing to being an American that this amendment is going to apply to the states as well. And it started out with the right to, I'm pretty sure it started out with the right to freedom of speech. And in the case, basically, the question that the court had to decide is what pornographic material was going to be protected and what wasn't. Could you possess it as an adult? Under the federal law, pornography is free speech. Under state law, not so much. The state could say, no, we're gonna regulate this for religious reasons. What the Supreme Court ended up saying, though, is that the right of Americans to possess free speech material is so fundamental to being an American that we're going to guarantee that we're going to incorporate it into what the states have to do. And there were various cases for each of the amendments that have been incorporated. The Third Amendment, for example, like I talked about, has not been incorporated. And that's mostly because I cannot find very many cases, if any, dealing with it directly. But so imagine in the beginning, there was no right to counsel, for example. In a case called Gideon versus Wainwright, that the Supreme Court said, even though at the federal level we've got the Fifth and Sixth Amendments saying you have the right to an attorney, at the federal level they were doing that. They had the federal public defender. At the state level, they were saying, nope, we don't have to do that. And so the Supreme Court slowly began integrating that and saying, yeah, you have to do that in capital cases, and then you have to do that in criminal cases. And kind of where the lay of the land exists at the moment is you have the right to an attorney in any case where imprisonment or worse is going to be a possibility. Do you have the right to an attorney on a traffic ticket? No. Do you have the right to an attorney on a possession of marijuana case? Yes. Sorry, I'm dating myself there. That's not really a charge you can get in Missouri anymore since we legalized it. I don't want to freak anybody out, especially if you're on marijuana and a little bit anxious. That was a very common charge when I first started practicing a decade ago in this city. Not much of a common charge any longer, though. There's still some that is illegal, but it's a lot. There's two must-knows. First, the Supremacy Clause. When valid national law conflicts with state law, national laws are going to win every time. And the second is the 10th Amendment logic. States keep powers not delegated to the national government. And guys, this is going to be a big thing we see playing out especially with what's going on in Minneapolis. Because is anybody not familiar with what's going on in Minneapolis and St. Paul? Sweet, no hands. I don't have to get into the details of all of that. Minnesota has sued the federal government, saying that basically the way that they're doing things, the way that they're preventing the state from investigating the deaths and everything, is a violation of their 10th Amendment right to basically be sovereign over their own area. So we're going to see this play out over the next year or so. I'd expect there to be a pretty quick decision from the district court. That's the trial court in the federal system. I think we'll hear something in the next couple of weeks, but then it will certainly be litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, whatever happens. And this is the stuff that changes laws. It makes precedent that we are going to follow for generations to come. So very apropos for today. Keep watching that kind of stuff and you'll see history made. So the big key point of this is that federalism isn't perfect. It's a negotiated boundary. It's often fought over, and it's often a really tough thing to kind of worry about because especially when it comes to concurrent powers, we get that, hey, who are we going to blame sort of thing. All right, when I ask you a question like, is this federal or is this state? Here's the analysis I want you to walk through. The first is to name the policy area. What are we actually looking at? So if you had an exam question that said, the state of Missouri wants to create a regulation about how nursing homes can operate, is this a federal or state issue? The analysis I want you to walk through is this 5-step process. The first is to name the policy area. What are we actually negotiating on? What are we regulating? The second is to identify the claimed national power. This is usually commerce, taxing, spending, civil rights, or enforcement of some one of those. Then we're going to ask what states traditionally control. So example, is this a police power? Is this health or safety? Is this public welfare? The next is you're going to check for conflicts. Is there a federal law or constitutional rule that overrides what the state's trying to do? And the last is to predict the fight. Which side benefits from federal control versus which side benefits from state control? As an example of this, I want to really quick mention criminal code. So we spoke about marijuana, and while it's not really being enforced, at a state level, the possession and use of marijuana is legal. At a federal level, it's still a Schedule I controlled substance. It is still a federal crime to possess or sell marijuana. It's not really being enforced, obviously, because there are so many states that have legalized it. The states have done a pretty good attempt of trying to get around it by creating this charade that the marijuana that exists in Missouri has always existed in Missouri from time immemorial. Because for the federal government to write a law that says it's illegal to possess marijuana, that's not a traditional power that they have. It's not something that's enumerated. So the way they do that is every single federal law has in it the phrase that's basically like, possess such marijuana having traveled in interstate commerce. Because again, if the federal government doesn't get to regulate the actual crime, they can regulate those things that are part of interstate commerce. So when we look at that, the federal government has really significantly expanded their power by using the Commerce Clause. We'll get deeper in that later on in the semester, but I wanted you to be aware that just because it looks clear-cut doesn't mean it necessarily is. There's going to be a lot of times where there is that conflict and you're just kind of scratching your head like, I don't have any idea why this is the way it is. I don't need you guys to get in the weeds like that. If I give you an exam question, I don't need you to go on a Commerce Clause analysis sort of thing, but I want you to be aware of that, because as we go on and we look at things like ICE and we look at things like when the Department of Homeland Security is saying, no, Minnesota, stay out, you might be asking yourself, how can that be? Well, the answer is it's extremely complicated, and you just need to be aware of that. So if we look at different things, let's go with food safety standards. Is food safety standards going to be federal or state? If we walk through this analysis, what's the policy that we're dealing with? Do you have one?
I'd say like the red dye and stuff, like inside of some foods, that was like very.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. I want you to go a little higher, and so I'll give it to you this time. We're dealing with like the welfare, or interstate commerce, or health and safety. But there's various policies that are involved. Most of them with food regulations are probably going to be at the state level, I would say. However, this is one of those that I think is pretty tricky because it's almost certainly going to be the federal level. So the claimed national power is going to be the Commerce Clause here. So this is going to be because so much of our food supply operates in interstate commerce. Now there's the local stuff, and that certainly is going to be regulated by the state. And it would be hard for the federal government to say that some local honey that I'm selling at a farmer's market has participated in interstate commerce. There's a way. But as long as I keep that in state and I don't try and cross the border with it, then I probably could still steer clear of the federal regulations. That's not the way most people are getting our food here. While it's an option to go to a farmer's market and buy something that's been locally raised and grown and everything, most of us are going to the grocery store, or we're going to a restaurant that has had their stuff shipped by a giant truck across the world. And because of that, the Commerce Clause is the actual policy that is going to be triggered here. It's been traveling in interstate commerce. We need one unified law to make it work. Yeah.
So how do like with the regulations work like between the state level and stuff? Where you have people like Michelle Obama that changed like the food regulations in school, and that wasn't just like the state level; that was like nationwide.
Yeah, and so we'll get to that in a little bit. The question for those of you at home is, if Obama changes the regulations about what constitutes a good school lunch, how does that affect the whole country if that's something that's traditionally a state power? And the answer to that question is the way that the federal government gives grants to people. Does anybody know why the drinking age in most states is 21? You have a guess?
I'm gonna say it has to do with like developmental things or like your brain is a preformed thing. I don't know.
Yeah, but why 21? Why not 24? Why not 18? The answer why we have that uniformity over the entire country is because one of the requirements of the block grant for your highway system that states get is that you have a state law that makes it illegal to drink under the age of 21. So is it a federal law that the drinking age is 21? No. The state gets around that, or the federal government gets around that because they decide how they're going to give out tax money. And they give the tax money out with the string attached that you have to do what we want or you don't get the money. It's the same thing with school lunches. When you get a school lunch, I think my son pays like $1.50 or $2 for his school lunch every day. It's much more expensive than that. It's probably like a whole $7 for his school lunch, probably $5. They don't give them very much, and it's pretty bad food, from what I understand. But those $3 are made up by the federal government through different grants and subsidies that are put in. That's also one of the reasons why if you go to an elementary school cafeteria right now, you'll find a giant thing of milk for the kids. Because as part of the school lunch program, the federal government said, we want kids to drink milk. Anyway, I digress. Did I answer your question about why we can have federal policies that aren't actually enumerated powers? Perfect.
I have a
What?
question.
Yeah.
But that also applies to like the director of like health, like Robert F. Kennedy, if he says something like we're going to remove like oils from a certain food or something like that, would that apply to all the states or would that just apply to like some? How would that work?
So that's an interesting question. Again, using the interstate commerce power or using the Commerce Clause, they could make it so it applies to all states. But that becomes a lot more tricky because what if I just love Red 40 and I decide that I'm going to open a local bakery and we're just going to bake everything with Red 40 in it? Would the FDA be able to prevent me from doing that? Probably not. Maybe. But what they're going to do is they're basically going to say, the other options they have is they could say like Red 40 is a controlled substance, or they could say it's a banned substance, or like nicotine, they could require a warning to be placed on packages that have that in it. And who's going to want to buy the cereal box that says, warning, this might kill your kid? So there's different levers that can be pulled to make it a global thing. So is there a conflict in our example of food safety? Maybe. Is there some sort of constitutional rule that's going to override it? Yeah, the Commerce Clause is always going to trump the state power. And we can predict the fight. We can see that like local people might say, this requirement is stupid. I don't want to do it. Which side benefits from federal control versus state control, though? I'm going to argue with when it comes to food safety and standards, typically the big guys are going to benefit where the little guys are going to suffer. If we have such strict standards that you need to be like a chemist to try and make food that complies with it, the people who have food chemists on staff are going to be able to do better than the people who are trying to make things in their kitchen, right? So who benefits? Probably the federal people. So we've got a couple of others, but I'm going to kind of skip through this. I will read them to you, and then we're going to kind of wrap up because we're almost out of time. So you guys can just kind of play at home. If we have environmental regulations, is this going to be a federal or state issue? Educational requirements, federal versus state. And then public health emergency rules, federal or state. Federalism shapes politics. First, these policy variations create states that are entirely different policy worlds. If you want to open a business, a lot of people open their business in Delaware, for example, because they have some of the most pro-business regulations in the country. Strategic behaviors, groups will often choose the level where they want the fight to be at because they think that they can win there. Abortion is a great example because for the beginning of the case and onward, the fight was always at the national level. But now they've kind of brought the fight down to the state level to try and see if they can win in different states instead. And then finally, accountability. There's frustration between who to blame or credit with different things. Was that the state or the feds who actually imposed that policy? With education policy, I wanted to note really quick, when we're talking about those grants and things that the feds give, that's one of the biggest areas because the state has always traditionally had the ability to set what our education policy is. But when it comes to how much money the federal government will give you, they'll only give it to you if you're also playing by their rules. So next class is when we're going to bring federalism into more of a real sense. This has been pretty ethereal. It's been kind of up in the clouds. We're going to bring it down to earth, and we're going to talk about money, mandates, preemption, and policy fights. And that's when we're going to see how all of this actually starts to, we're going to see the rubber meet the road, more or less. I've got just about 2 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Shoot.
I wanted to quickly go back to when you were talking about freedom of speech.
Yeah.
So like whenever a tech company owner, let's say Twitter or something, or Elon Musk, prohibits its users from saying something against another political party, how does the Constitution work in that instance? Would it send regulations or rules to that company, or how would that?
So that's an interesting question. It shouldn't. And the reason it shouldn't is because in deciding what gets published, that is part of exercising free speech. And so in reality, it's an issue that's being toyed with because when Donald Trump was president the first time, there was a lot of information that was sent out on Twitter and Facebook and stuff by Republicans that was factually inaccurate and deemed by a lot of people to in fact be dangerous. So, for example, nobody should drink bleach to try and cure COVID. That's a bad idea. Bleach will kill you. And so you saw these platforms taking things like that down for safety reasons. And that made people so angry because like, you're violating my right to freedom of speech. However, it's not a public forum. If the government were to take it down, if the government were to be acting to make that happen, that's one thing. But because it's a private company that's doing it, that's not the government acting. And the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is only going to apply to the government.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's...
Yeah. So it's a real sticky situation because then we saw the pendulum swing, and now a lot of tech companies are erring on the other side. Other questions? Sweet. If I didn't get you on the roll, come on up, and I will see you guys on Friday.